Hello and welcome. In this video we're going to continue the discussion about distributive justice by looking at a paper that takes maybe a more particular view of distributive justice rather than just giving broad philosophical principles. So this is a way of looking at distributive justice in a more concrete and applied sense. And it's this paper by the philosopher Tommie Shelby. And the paper is called Race and Ethnicity, Race and Social Justice, Rawlsian Considerations. So where we're going to go is we're going to see Shelby's argument that a Rawlsian outlook can help us to explain a way forward in dealing with racial inequality in America. So the plan is we're going to look at this question of whether Rawls's theory can address the issue of racism. We will look at and foreshadow the next place that we're going to go by looking at an objection from Charles Mills, who has argued that liberal theorists, thinkers like Rawls, who is part of the social contract tradition, will fail to address racism. And as we'll see, Shelby's going to develop a reply where he's going to argue that the Rawlsian approach should be seen as giving us a good explanation for how formal justice and anti-discrimination can be rightly read off of Rawls's principles and thereby give us a way of thinking about racial inequality and what to do about it. So let's get to work on this important question. So Shelby starts with this thought. Many scholars have pointed out that Rawls's theory of justice, as well as his later work in political liberalism, both which we've already looked at, don't directly point to issues and problems related to race and racism, or these broader questions of civil rights and social justice. And here's an important point. Here's maybe an explanation of why Rawls does not do this. Rawls's theory of justice, his two principles, his equal liberty principle and the difference principle that he gives us in theory of justice, is what we call a strict compliance theory of justice. It's imagining a just society in which everybody is living according to certain principles. Most importantly, the difference principle, which has told us that we can only accept inequality in our society so long as that situation of equality makes the worst case scenario better than it would be in the situation where there was more strict equality, right? So this is a highly idealized theory. The strict compliance theory imagines that everybody follows the rules of justice. And as we know, in actual society, people don't follow strictly any rules of justice, none less Rawls's equal liberty principle and difference principle. So in this way, it's sometimes pointed out that Rawls is doing what they call ideal theory. This is giving us an ideal of justice, and then we're sort of thinking in the real world, which is an ideal, we're thinking about ways in which we can approximate the ideal, right? But there are hard questions about what do we do in a society where some people are not acting justly, and we have to deal with the fact that injustices have been done in the past, and many people are still dealing with those injustices. So in this way, when we look at partial compliance theories of justice, what do we do in a society where some people, but not all people, act justly? Those theories, it is said, will give us more to say about how to rectify, how to do something about past wrongs. We'll recall that Robert Nozick made some remarks about how if we had a perfect theory of justice and distributive justice, we would just have to talk about acquisitions and transfers of property. But given that some property has been unjustly acquired, we would also have to look at rectification. So again, in an imperfect world, we might have to give a theory of rectification. And because Rawls is doing ideal theory, we might think Rawls is going to be able to say less about how to deal with racial injustices in the highly imperfect society that we live in. Well, here's a first thing that Shelby can equip the defender of Rawls with, and it's the basics of Rawls's methodology for doing moral theorizing and political reflection. And the first thing that we need to remember is that Rawls endorses a practice that he calls reflective equilibrium. So the idea is that you're going to revise the moral principles that you hold in light of moral beliefs that you have. So for instance, if you have the belief that it would be wrong to sacrifice the rights or well-being or even life of one particular individual in order to serve the common good, we might say that that's a moral belief that we hold, and then we revise the moral principles that we hold. So Rawls would say, like, look, if you won't sacrifice the one for the many, we're basically saying that the ends won't justify the means, and in that way we might delete a utilitarian approach from our set of considered moral principles. But we might develop a principle that says we must respect the rights and liberties of many, and because of this, we might use that moral principle to get clearer on particular moral beliefs that we might hold. Say, moral beliefs about abortion, or moral beliefs about voting requirements, right? We might also notice that it's not as if all of our deeply morally held beliefs, deeply held moral beliefs, are up for revision. We might say that even though we don't hold them as axiomatic or eternal truths, we may well start our moral theorizing with a core set of provisional fixed points that are less open to revision than maybe some more particular moral beliefs. So there are core provisional fixed points within Rawls's process of doing this interplay between our specific moral beliefs and the philosophical principles that we use to justify those moral beliefs. And here's a nice observation that Shelby makes, is that Rawls's theory starts with the deeply held belief that racial discrimination is unjust. So that is one of our first inputs for reflective equilibrium. So we would put it here at the level of provisional fixed points, the things that we're going to believe more robustly than some of our other deeply held moral beliefs in this interplay of principles and beliefs. Moreover, think about Rawls's idea of the original position. Remember, we're trying to work out the rules of society as self-interested negotiators, but we don't know what position we will wind up in society, what our identities will be. All the contingent facts about your place in society will be unknown. Well, racial identity is one of the factors about yourself that will be deleted from your set of knowledge when you start to negotiate the rules for society from the original position. So in this way, Shelby is going to point out that even though Rawls's theory of justice doesn't explicitly mention race or racism right at the outset, we would say Rawls does give us a great deal of philosophical machinery, a good philosophical toolkit that can allow us to explain what's wrong with racial bias, racial discrimination, and racially based inequalities in society. Now, let's go to a further look at people who are pessimistic about Rawls's ability to deal with racial injustice. And this will bring us to the philosopher Charles Mills. And Charles Mills is interested in this idea that, like, look, when we have a theory of justice, we want something that is supposed to get us to true freedom and equality. And liberalism tells us that it is officially about treating citizens as free and equal. But Mills, in some perhaps provocative and also groundbreaking work, has argued that when we look at the history of how liberalism has been defended, especially in social contract theories, Rawls may well come in for a challenge from Mills. Because Mills is going to tell us that social contract theories, sometimes called contractarianism, have excluded non-white men from full personhood. So if we go back to Hobbes, if we go back to Rousseau, and so forth, these theorists have tended to treat non-white people as less than human. It's tended to exclude them from the process of bargaining about who is included in the social contract. And given that even the founders of the United States of America were highly influenced by these social contract theorists, as well as people like Locke, we'll see that these intellectual traditions weren't fighting against white supremacy. In fact, it was part of the process of creating white supremacy. And in this way, if we're going to deal with white supremacists as they've affected the way that we think and talk and govern our lives, we need to think more seriously about how those sorts of insidious forces might still be part of the way our laws are written and the way that we talk about who is free and who is equal. But Shelby does offer a response here. For one thing, even though Rawls does fit into this tradition of social contract theories, he's not as interested in the founders' motives, right? So even though, say, Locke and Hobbes may have had racist and colonialist outlooks, and we've seen some of those racist and colonialist outlooks in our readings, especially in the way that they've spoken about indigenous peoples, we might say that those particular motivations are not the most important thing to know about these social contract theories, right? We might think that what's right about traditional social contract theories is that freedom and equality is a powerful idea, right? And when we separate the way that these theories were spelled out from the philosophical core of the theories, we might think that there is still something valuable in that philosophical core. And Shelby will point out that Rawls gives a clearly specified set of conditions under which we might see a way of governing as just, right? And for instance, Rawls will tell us that a just society with just laws will be accountable and created by the people. Laws will be communicated and there will be public consultation about them. But the most important formal constraint on how we think about justice is that justice has universality to it. And the idea of universality, as it relates to the topic of racism, is that a universalist approach to justice says that the principles of a justice will apply to, so they will expect certain sacrifices from each of us. They'll give each of us certain duties. And it's also going to protect all individuals. So we all get these rights and responsibilities from a universal way of thinking about justice. And how universally does this theory of justice apply? Well, we're going to see it applying to all individuals with what Rawls calls moral personality. So let's just build out how universality and moral personality fit together. So what is it to have moral personality for Rawls? Well, the first thing is you have a conception of the good. So you are able to think in terms of good and bad, right and wrong, just and unjust. And not only can you recognize what could be counted as just or unjust, but you're also capable of being motivated by that sense of justice. So you might sacrifice a good, given that you understand that justice expects that other people might be entitled to that resource. So anybody listening to this video, anybody doing some philosophy, is clearly an individual with moral personality. You are clearly thinking about the good, and it seems like even doing the work of thinking about the nature of justice is a way of changing your behavior, right? You are engaged in this process of civil discourse to figure out the right thing to do. But moreover, not only do you think about the right thing to do, you're probably doing things in line with your understanding of your responsibilities and your entitlements as a citizen. Now, Rawls says that moral personality is sufficient for having moral entitlements. So everybody who's doing these things of having a concept of the good and acting on their sense of justice will deserve certain moral protections from this universal approach to justice. Now, it's important to note that Rawls is saying that perhaps moral personality is not necessary for having moral entitlements. So if we're thinking of somebody with, say, stunted conscience who isn't capable of being motivated by their sense of justice, or if you have certain cognitive limitations, whether through being in a coma, being an infant, being someone with severe cognitive disabilities, you might lack a conception of the good. These individuals also might have moral entitlements, but the main thing is that most ordinary people aren't in that situation, and they definitely, and through this idea of moral personality, have basic entitlements of justice. Now, the way that Shelby thinks about it, this notion of universality of justice, it will rule out classes of subhumans. So, we couldn't imagine certain individuals with a conception of the good who are also excluded from full participation within a democracy, or who don't get their rights protected. That would be to treat somebody as subhumans. And Rawls himself explicitly mentions that race is irrelevant to moral personality. So no matter what race you are of, you will be able to meet the standard of basic moral personality, according to Rawls. There's a few arguments for why we shouldn't exclude individuals from counting as having moral personality. In Rawls's later book, Political Liberalism, he's thinking about justice as a political process of setting aside all controversial philosophical disputes. And in this way, we want to have an overlapping consensus, sort of a broad compromise-seeking approach to what individuals have basic rights and have moral personality. And that's going to cast a wide net, right? That's the way that we get a political consensus-based agreement among people, is we treat more people as having rights. We don't rule people out, right? So because we would be bringing in controversial philosophical assumptions to nitpick or say that some groups of people lack moral personality, we would sort of ban sorting on this consensus-seeking approach. And on this view, look, if you are able to participate in politics at all, you should be able to be seen as having the same basic entitlements. And of course, this whole approach is a way of speaking back to Mills's objection that this liberal tradition has implicit exclusion written into it. Rawls will also have another idea in his toolkit that can help us to understand what's wrong with racism. He says that institutions can be seen as both forms of conduct or realizations of rules in thought and conduct. So notice that when we talk about forms of conduct, we're talking about general structures, general principles, the idea of a good society, the concept of good healthcare or a good university. But we can also talk about institutions not as just the concept of something like a university or a medical system, but we can also look at institutions as real concrete things that have been carried out in various forms of thought and conduct. And when we start thinking about the second thing, how we're realizing certain principles in our society, one thing that we want to look for is formal justice, right? And when we have formal justice, we're talking about impartial, consistent administration of rules and laws. So we want to make sure that there are no failures in applying the law consistently and correctly. And of course, racial prejudices would be one example of such a failure. So there have been studies which have suggested that people of racial minorities convicted of the same crimes with similar criminal records will sometimes get harsher sentences. Now, if we can bear out this study as factual, then this would show that we are not applying the law consistently and correctly. Either we are punishing the majority group too leniently, or we're punishing the minority group too harshly, right? So in this way, we might have failure of formal justice. You need to treat similar cases similarly. So just to take another example, we can admit that a speed limit law would be, in principle, just. But if one group in society was punished more than another group, and we're assuming here similar levels of law breaking, but if we found that black folks got more speeding tickets than white folks, even though they speed at the same rate, or that women get more speeding tickets than men, even though they speed at the same rate, or vice versa, this would be a failure to treat similar cases similarly, and that would be a failure of formal justice. And of course, many of the problems that we see with racial injustice in this country could be explained in just this way. So, sentencing, we might talk about laws that impact racialized communities more frequently than white communities. And in these ways, we could say that Rawls gives us another tool for explaining problems with racial injustice in our society. Now, one philosopher, Shauna Schifrin, says it's in a certain way a disappointment that in John Rawls's theory, he doesn't just explicitly put in an anti-discrimination principle, along with his two principles of justice, basic liberties, and the difference principle. Why wouldn't we just say, like, look, there are certain protected classes, like race or gender, that cannot be part of our considerations of how we administer the law and form our society? Here, Shelby's going to reply, we need to think about when and where we're bringing in what principles. And he notes that Rawls gives us a suggestion about how we apply principles of justice, and the extent to which we're working behind the veil of ignorance is going to happen in stages. So, when we're agreeing to the first basic principles of society, and here Rawls is thinking about the basic liberties and the difference principle, which gives us a constraint on the ways in which we deviate from perfect equality, right? These are done with a high level of ignorance, right? You don't know the particular facts about what sorts of problems your society is facing. You're trying to give a formalized, ideal theory of what any society should be looking for, right? But Rawls does acknowledge that there might be a second constitutional stage, and we might even think that at this stage, within justice, there would be a partial lifting of the veil of ignorance. Now, in this way, we'd have delegates, advocates, selecting government powers and basic liberties for citizens. But at this stage, they would have more knowledge about the basic facts of society, facts about, say, society's resources. So, that if you're talking about somewhere like Canada, the people arguing for the Constitution at this point would know maybe that there aren't a lot of people in the country, but there are a lot of material goods like oil and wood. And moreover, we could know things about the history of our society. So you could know things about the prevalence of racism in a society once we're arguing not at the first stage of full ignorance and basic principles, but once we're stipulating government powers, and once we're dealing with a more particularized version of a society. At this point, we could design government and a list of freedoms that would be directly aimed at dealing with racist principles and policies that have affected a place in the past. So again, Shelby is seeing ways of giving the Rawlsian a toolkit for addressing racism. The way that Shelby puts it is we don't need to explicitly write in this sort of anti-discrimination principle that Schifrin was advocating for if our two principles get us to eventually ruling out racial discrimination de facto. This distinction between de jure and de facto basically means de facto is a state of affairs that is true in fact but not officially sanctioned. In contrast, de jure means a state of affairs that's in accordance with the law as explicitly stated. So for instance, we might look at the way in which, in some cultures, and at least for some people, if police find a person with marijuana, they will look the other way, and they will not charge them to the fullest extent of the law. And in this way, we might say that marijuana possession, it might be de jure illegal, but it is de facto not illegal, right? Because it's not officially sanctioned, but as a matter of fact, you're not going to suffer legal penalties for that law violation. We might also look at speed limits, right? If you're going down I-40 here in North Carolina, the speed limit signs usually say either 65 or 70. But if you're going 69 miles an hour on a 65 road, you are technically above the speed limit, but no police officer will ever pull you over for that. The rumor is, and you shouldn't depend on me saying this, but it's rumored that sometimes police officers will say, if you're over by 9, you're fine, right? And in this way, we might say that being 9 miles an hour over the speed limit is de facto legal, even if not de jure legal. Now, we might have a similar point. Racial discrimination might not, in our constitutional principles, be de jure illegal. But if realizing the principles that are de jure required, it will rule out racial discrimination de facto. So not explicitly stated, but in the way that things are carried out, we will rule things out de facto, as well as rule things in to legality by looking the other way. Getting closer to the end, Shelby is also mindful that there are some people who will say, the difference principle that Rawls gives us is mainly a way of thinking about class, right? It's thinking about people with X number of dollars in their wallet and whether we can have people with less money than X being okay with the fact that these inequalities exist. And this seems to be mainly looking at things on class lines rather than race lines. Here's a couple points that Shelby gives in response to this sort of concern. One is that the difference principle isn't necessarily needed to explain the wrongness of racial inequality. And when we look at the letter of exactly how Rawls states his principles about inequality in society, one thing that he will talk about is, is the level of access to resources for people at the bottom raised enough and good enough to tolerate other people having more? But another thing that Rawls will tell us is not only should we have only certain levels of contingently justified levels of inequality in our society, but it's also that offices and positions of power or opportunity need to be open to all, right? And in this way, we need sameness of prospects and openness of opportunity for all individuals. And the way that Shelby thinks about it, if we really believe in true equality of opportunity, your economic standing should not be affected by whether or not your ancestors were victims of enslavement. And in this way, in order to equalize opportunity, we need to correct against these sorts of historic injustices. Put more money into the pockets of those who are in marginalized communities, because only when we have basic needs met can we hope that people in less advantaged and racialized communities, might end up seeking university educations, entering the professional class, eventually running for public office, eventually maybe occupying positions of power, whether that be president of the United States or governor or congressperson, right? But the idea is that we would need to do a lot of work in correcting against those sorts of disadvantages of opportunity. And once we made those corrections, we would expect similar opportunities, and we'd know that we have similar opportunities for all when we have different outcomes across racial groups. And in this way, Rawls's fair equality of opportunity principle is a great way of advocating for putting more money into the pockets of those in marginalized and racialized communities. One last point. It's sometimes said that racism is a systemic problem, but we also note that racism is a problem that we find in the hearts of individual people. Now, when Shelby wrote this paper, he was thinking that, most explicit racism and individual cruelty is stigmatized in such a way that people don't state it out loud, but that they, have these quieter biases that affect their behavior, but they're not speaking their biases out loud anymore. But at that same level, these biases can impact people at a broad societal systematic level. Right? Now, this is sometimes thought of as a problem for Rawls because Rawls is arguing for changes to the structure of institutions rather than the feelings, prejudices, and thinking of individuals. Now, Shelby says maybe to some extent the fact that this sort of individual racism, which Shelby saw as something that's quieter and less spoken and maybe a bit subtler, when he wrote this paper in the 2010s, That may well have been the right analysis. Maybe now that some racists tend to be a bit more emboldened and less ashamed of saying racist things in public, maybe that's the sort of thing we want to go after. That might be the concern for Rawls, who is so heavily focused on the structure of institutions rather than the hearts of individuals. But Shelby says maybe this focus on institutions isn't as bad of a thing as some of these critics make it out to be. Because one thing is that institutions have a profound influence on individuals. So if we make university spots open and accessible to people of all different classes and races, we might think that could change some hearts and minds. That when we have high-achieving poor folks, many high-achieving black folks doing their thing within society, it becomes harder for the racist to see marginalized classes as subhuman or lesser than. So one thing we might say is look, institutions and setting them up in the right way might be a smart strategy for fighting prejudice in individuals. But furthermore, if institutions are good, if they are accessible, then that will be a way of dampening the effect of the prejudice of individuals, and those individual prejudices will be less likely to inhibit a person's achievement. And Shelby's final suggestion for the paper, if we might think about taking a realist approach, we might think that institutional reform is actually an easier thing than changing hearts and minds one at a time. And in this way, Rawls's institutionalism might actually be seen as the realist, non-utopian approach to the very pervasive and difficult question of how to deal with racial prejudice in our society. I think that that's where we should end. As we can see, what we've seen in this paper is that Shelby wants to point out that Rawls has many ways of talking about and dealing with and philosophizing through problems of race and racial discrimination. So even though some commentators have rightly noted that sometimes race isn't explicitly mentioned in Rawls's basic principles of justice, they can be used as a powerful tool to deal with this very real, concrete, and urgent issue within the conversation about how to make America a more just society. So, thanks for listening in, and as always, if any questions or thoughts emerge, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Take care.